Hello and welcome to our event, Unseen Architecture Part 2, which we're proud to present in collaboration with Musicity. My name's Amy Croft and I'm the Curator of Exhibitions and Events for Sto. Firstly, a couple of notes about the Zoom webinar. We're going to take your questions at the end of the conversation, and we'd love you to do this in person. So I'll privately message you through the chat to agree if you'd be happy to do this or not. So please do keep adding your questions into the chat throughout the event. To kick this evening's event off, I'd like to quote from a poignant moment from one of the speakers in part 1. Architect Elsie Owusu pointed out, "For me, I've always thought about sound as in a sort of negative way in architecture, more how to keep sound out and control it. But this experience has really made me think about allowing sound in and it becoming an integral part of the architecture." This is a testament to the concept of Musicity Expo, curated by Luscombe and Clare Farrow, who have commissioned 7 new experimental sound works composed in response to the acoustic qualities of 7 unrealised or imagined architectural projects. For Sto, as a manufacturer of a range of acoustic systems which can be used to control sound reverberation, Elsie's comments also bring to the fore the creative possibilities of considering a building's acoustics at these early concept stages, when sound, architecture and acoustics can become fluidly encapsulated. We're honoured to be joined this evening by such an interdisciplinary panel of speakers who will all delve into these topics and much more. To introduce them individually, I'll now hand over to our host for this evening, co-curator of Musicity Expo, Clare Farrow. Thank you.
So thank you, Amy and Sto Werkstatt, and welcome everyone to this second webinar panel discussion for Musicity Expo, which is www.mscty.space, which I've co-curated with BBC Radio 3 presenter and founder of Musicity, Luscombe, and this is the website. If you haven't already visited the website, please do and explore the 7 collaborations through images, videos, words and sound. The project was launched in partnership with London Design Festival 2020 and is designed to be a free, travelling digital and virtual meeting place for architecture and music. In this strange and seemingly dystopian year of COVID-19, which has seen physical and sensory disconnection, protest, the closing of music and venues and theatres, and the empty silence of lockdown cities, Musicity Expo has sought to create an infinite, vibrant and richly layered space where dialogue between disciplines can happen and where imagined and unrealised visions of the future can come together and where we can explore the links between architecture and music. As Goethe famously said, music is liquid architecture. Architecture is frozen music. In my essay on the Musicity Expo website, Architecture in Time and Step with Music, I looked at the meaning of Goethe's words, at the geometry, patterns and rhythms in architecture and music, for example, but also the fact that our perception or experience of architecture is not only static, but very much to do with the senses, with time, changing light on materials, movement, acoustics, even scent. And I thought of the work of Japanese artist Hiroshige, whose woodblock prints have inspired the designs of architect Kengo Kuma. And I think this image by Hiroshige from 1856, Wisteria at Kamaido Tenjin Shrine, is an interesting way or symbol to begin this webinar discussion. A bridge can be a place of solitude, as it is in Lily Jencks' project. It can be a place where people pass by without speaking, but it can also be a place for meeting, for sharing ideas and making connections, which is what this evening is about. And as we go along, as Amy said, please start to send in your questions or thoughts via the chat as soon as you think of them for the Q&A session at the end. And if you do, you might be invited to come on screen and join the participants. So you might want to change out of your Zoom pajamas. So if we can go to the gallery of speakers, I'm very happy to introduce you to our panel of speakers for this evening. Lily Jencks, landscape and architectural designer and founder of Jencks Squared, whose work includes the Maggie Centre Gardens in Hong Kong and Glasgow. Lily collaborated with composer and artist Hannah Peel for Musicity Expo. Yuval Avital, multimedia artist, composer and guitarist, whose interdisciplinary work includes operas, dance and music performances and sound sculptures in art and non-art venues, and whose studio is in Milan. Yuval collaborated with Daniel Libeskind for Musicity Expo. And then PiM.studio architects Maurizio Mucciola and Maria Chiara Pizzinelli, who worked with Kengo Kuma in Japan and on the V&A Dundee, and now have their own studio in London. Maurizio and Maria Chiara collaborated with sound artist McConville for Musicity Expo. And then two Arup specialists who I worked with in 2018 on this LDF installation, Memory and Light by composer Arvo and Arup for the V&A's Norfolk House Music Room. Theatre, venue and acoustics designer Ed Elbourne and acoustics specialist Ned Crowe, who are about to appear. I should also say that the bench and screen design was by Arup's Stephen Phillips. So before we begin with Lily's project, I thought I'd ask each of you to choose just a few words or a line or a quote that for you captures the links, the relationship between architecture and music or acoustics. So I'll go first to Lily.
Such a challenge, Claire. Hi. See you all. I was thinking that music was kind of the ultimate art form in terms of form, because it is, in a way, it is purely form. But then I realized, in thinking about Yuval, who's just come from a performance, that also music and architecture are both stages and infrastructure for emotion. So I've totally changed my mind about what I was going to say in the last 15 minutes of our talking. But I think it's both those things. There's a kind of, in architecture, we aspire to, a lot of architecture, I should say, aspires to kind of pure form in some way. We can think of it as pure form, but also it's incredible infrastructure and a stage for our emotions and life. Yeah.
Fantastic. Yuval.
So in this challenge that was revealed to me just a few moments ago, the two words I want to choose is ascendance and descendance, which is also deeply connected to the project I've done with Daniel. And may I just quote a very short mystical poem by a branch of the Hasidic Jews, which says, when the soul goes down into the body, when it descends into the body, it shouts, vai, 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 vai. This descendance is made to an ascendance, so everything will be worthwhile.
Beautiful. And may I say your background is also beautiful. So that's your studio in Milan.
Yeah. Everybody come for coffee.
Now. PiM.studio, Maurizio and Maria Chiara.
Hello, good evening, everyone. My word is flow, because I think architecture and music, they are both flow, and they work with flow, and they have completely different flow somehow. Sometimes you cross architecture very quickly. And then as a designer, we always pay attention to the flow, like where people are going, where they enter, where they go through, and like how is your experience of the building when you will visit it. So I feel that like flow is the word that I've been proposing to you.
Thank you. It's a beautiful word.
Hi everyone. The words I've been thinking of as are silence and void, because I think they're both very much related to architecture and music. Because in the same way as we always think that the void is never empty because it's filled with space and is surrounded by architecture. And then in a very similar way, the silence is never quiet, I would say, because there are always sounds. Silence is always very intense and very filled with emotions. So I think there are two concepts that in music and in architecture, they're very related and very intense.
Yeah, lovely. Actually, they're the same words that the composer Arvo Pärt chose as well, with silence and the void, which you wouldn't necessarily associate with music, but yeah. Ed, can I ask you the same question? Hi.
You can. My three words that I chose were curation, audience, experience, because I'll speak a bit about this later, I think, but fundamentally with music and architecture, that's what we are doing. We are curating an audience experience.
Yeah, fantastic. And Ned?
I think your question reminded me of Avital, who's the founder of our firm. He did a key speech in the 70s where he talks about total architecture and total design, and how the ultimate aim is to have all disciplines working together, thinking about the total experience of people who are going to be in the built environment. So that led me to come up with the words sensory immersion, envelopment, and presence.
Beautiful. Thank you very much. And isn't it interesting that everyone chose different words? So thank you everyone for that beautiful beginning, which sets the scene. And so now I'm going to turn to Lily to introduce your project with its intriguing title, The Horizon, Your Steps Are a Metronome, 30 minutes, 23rd of July, 2020.
Thank you, Claire. So there are some slides. It's kind of a little bit of an academic beginning to oops, hold on. I've now lost my notes. Sorry, 1 second.
Okay, we'll look at the image first. Tell us what the image is while you look for your notes.
Yeah, it's a diagram by Robert Flood from 1670, who was a Renaissance man, and he was interested in the structure of musical harmony based on a cosmic order. And you can see there the hand of God kind of defining the music of the spheres. That's what this diagram is. And the 3 harmonic scales. And I love this diagram. I show it often to my students as a kind of just a beautiful diagram, but showing how the structure and order, and as I was saying in the beginning, the kind of perfect form, there is a kind of ideal, there's an idea of a perfect form in music and also in architecture. If you go to the next slide. And that, if we go back into classical architecture over time, you can see lots of architects have looked at mathematical proportion and ratios and form from the Greek temple, which has this A-B rhythm on a facade. That facade obviously is made of columns that are fluted. So you're kind of using the metaphor, many metaphors of music in classical architecture, not just classicism, also Le Corbusier was looking at those proportions in his modular man. If you go to the next slide. And I wanted to just show La Tourette, which I'm sure everybody knows was designed with Ioannis Xenakis, who was an engineer and also a composer. And what I love about this facade, and this is where I started thinking about my drawing for this project, it was looking at facades, and this facade is the kind of ultimate musical score in a way, and you can imagine it. You can play the music in your mind with this kind of deep bass in the lower level, and then this staccato rhythm above, layered, these kind of melodies layered, meshed into each other. And I started thinking about how facades have kind of musical implications of them, and how as you walk the streets, you get into a rhythm, a kind of meditative rhythm along with the facades. Next image. And there you see Xenakis kind of thinking about the compression and expansion, almost exactly like sound waves on the facade. Next image. And so being in London, that's just a collage of, you know, postmodern building, just to show that still architects are looking at kind of rhythmic music in the design of facades. That's Alan Short's School of Slavic and Eastern European Studies. And if you go to the next slide. So I was thinking about how you walk, you relate to elevations through your body and as a kind of musical score, how a street might be a musical score. This is Ed Ruscha's Every Building Along Sunset Boulevard, which is kind of an unfolded elevations, and it's also in a way that the object is like a musical score, because you kind of perform it as you unfold it. You read the drawing through time, which is something I was interested in. Next image. That's just a zoom in where you see the unfolded elevations next to each other. Next image. And another thing I love about it is that you see time, you know, there's a kind of timelessness and a mathematical kind of consistency in this flat elevational images, but also it's obviously a moment that is recorded through the photographs. You get the cars moving past, or the people and the fashions of that period. So there's this nice juxtaposition between it being kind of timeless drawing and also very specific moment. Next image. So I went on this quite emotional walk, and for various reasons, personal reasons, and it wasn't the beauty of Sunset Boulevard, but it was the kind of a canyon of a very busy street in London. And I was walking as this kind of meditative experience. And next image, and I walked over the Thames, which is, you know, when you're in London and you're in these intense canyon streets, and then you open out onto the river, and the Thames, you know, tons and tons, literally, of water is rushing underneath you, and the sky is kind of rushing above you, the clouds. And Claire, you asked me to do a drawing about nature in the city, and I really didn't want to do something about kind of trees and little fragments of ecology. So I thought probably this, like having the Thames in there, which has probably got the wildest microbiome in the city, would be something to bring into the drawing. And next image, and that's next image. Yeah, that kind of connecting you with wider flows, like the rivers in the sky, or the flows of the starlings, as PiM.studio we're talking about flows. Next image. So this is the kind of first layer of the drawing, which is photographs every 10 steps. And since it's unseen architecture, the elevations are removed. And you can see how long it takes. It's a half an hour walk along this bit of city and over the bridge, and you can see here on the top, you know, is the first half of the half hour, and on the bottom is the second half, and how much the weather has changed in that time. Next image. And this is the kind of primordial soup of the Thames, which is just kind of a fascinating surface, if you know it, in London, you know, because it contains so much. You know, it was the drain of London, it was the trash can of London for thousands of years. Also, you know, it is literally the drowner of dreams as people jump into it. And it contains, you know, a huge amount of incredible bacteria and strength. Next image. And so when you walk, this kind of walk or musical score drawing was just about that. This is on the other side of the bridge, and kind of going back into the city and back into the canyon, where the buildings kind of zip up. And yeah, the whole drawing, as you can see, if you go to the next image, is really about that relationship to the horizon as you're walking along in the canyon of the city, and then how the horizon and the river opens up. And I was interested in trying to think about how to create some kind of musical score of that place, in a way, an abstraction of it, a mapping of it, which is the first job that you do as any architect, kind of map a place and think of how that could be abstracted in several different ways through the drawing, through both kind of raster images and also line work data. And that's it. You can play, I think the next image is the...
Are we going to see the final piece?
The next image, yeah, the next image
listen
is Hannah's
to
video, Hannah's score, sorry, and then I was scrolling through the drawing.
Yeah. Thanks, Lily. I love the poetry in the piece, and the fact that when you first see it on the website, it looks like an abstract drawing, an abstract work of art, and then you can zoom in, and then there's so much detail. Tiny boats, the details of the water in sections, and the words. It's really beautiful. And what did you feel when you heard Hannah's response? Because I know you spoke to her. Was it on the phone? You had a conversation. What did you feel when you heard the music and saw it with your drawing?
I mean, it's a fascinating process because we worked on, or many of us worked on the drawings first, and then I think musicians were asked to kind of respond to that. And so I hadn't talked to Hannah at all while I was working on it. And I didn't want to kind of input too much because I felt like I'd done a whole drawing, and I'd actually made a little video as well with this kind of poem, and I felt like I'd given her enough work. And so I was really pleased that she had taken it and kind of created something that's really her own without too much. I mean, she'd taken it as a musical score, and I can hear the music, the visual through listening. But it felt like she created something, that was totally, obviously, her own, and complemented it in a really interesting way, and was interesting to, it adds another layer and another time element to a drawing that I know very well. Yeah.
And fascinating to see a drawing in terms of a score as something that you can read and scroll down and explore like you can music. So on that note, I'm going to bring Yuval. Hi, Yuval. So we're going to turn to your project, your collaboration, which was with Daniel Libeskind. So Daniel Libeskind grew up in the post-war city of Łódź in Poland, which was then post-war part of the Soviet Union. He was the son of 2 Holocaust survivors, and in an exhibition that I did called Childhood Recollections, Memory and Design, he described how music in the form of an accordion had brought colour and joy into his life. So in this image, you can see a very sweet Daniel Libeskind in 1955, playing the accordion, and he became a really talented performer on the accordion. So for this collaboration, Yuval has responded to Libeskind's Theatrum Mundi series of 12 artworks from 1983, which the architect described at the time as the premonition of an unknown virus invading a city. So this seemed an amazing series of artworks to include in Musicity Expo in 2020. To invite Daniel to give his thoughts now from this perspective of this COVID-19 year, and to invite Yuval to respond through music. So Yuval, over to you.
Well, you know, music or sound meets architecture in our lifetime, first in the womb, and then when we are born in our mouth, our body, but mainly our mouth. The mouth becomes the first architectural space in which our voice shouts into the world. And inside this element of sound, which will follow us all our life, in which all our life we will be a sound instrument in a way, until the day we will pass. We somehow respond and translate our deepest feelings or our daily life routine as sensitive membranes that somehow explode to the outside world with these frequencies that luckily we comprehend and put inside of us also as listeners. Daniel Libeskind's Theatrum Mundi hit me like lightning in the middle of the summer. I wasn't expecting the invitation from you, Claire. I haven't heard from you for many years. Somehow the circles came back. And when you first mentioned this possibility, you gave me also the first message in a battle of Daniel speaking about this work. Now, Theatrum Mundi, is it an architecture piece or is it an artwork? This is a series of drawings in which Daniel, if I can speak on his behalf, described the scenario of cities collapsing in an epidemic, which is not a viral epidemic like the one we experience today, but a spiritual epidemic. And this collapsing was made with color and ink and collage, creating scenarios that in first glance, for me, as an artist, it was of great impact, but as a musician, it was a score. Each one also titled with enigmatic titles that worked and functioned like mantras. And so already there was a mantra and there was a mandala to start a meditation. And in fact, the title Meditations on Theatrum Mundi or Theatrum Mundi Meditation, I don't remember how it was written finally, is a deep response to this journey, this story that should be told and told over and over again. Now, Theatrum Mundi is a term that was coined in the medieval time, speaking about the illusionary world that stops us from seeing a deeper layer of world. And I think that in this point, I started thinking of ascension and descension. As a first intuition, I knew that Daniel was an infant prodigy of the accordion. I also told Daniel after, in a later conversation, that many of his architecture piece looks like the accordion bellows, this opening, this threshold that somehow breaks the square. And I said, why don't I use as materia prima my pieces for accordion already existing? And I love the accordion, and I wrote for 34 accordions and for 7 accordions and 7 accordions again. And I took this large amount of sonic material and started distracting it, graining it, freezing it, creating a kind of a grammar in which, parallelly to Daniel's destruction of cities in his images, was created inside the sound. Now, I think that many artists experience this feeling that when you enter a piece deeply, you enter it almost in a physical level. It becomes a microcosmos in which it becomes a habitat that has its own physical rules. And here, the descendants of order created strange physical virtual phenomena, such as the stretching of time and something unordinary in time. And for me, at the end, it became a piece on which I worked for months, and a 60 minutes piece, which is almost like a symphonic piece with 12 movements. I think the basic thing here is that maybe in the beginning I was aiming to read Daniel's works as a score, but from a certain point, it was like Daniel and me were looking from different edges of a mountain into a third point, which was an idea. And I think that much could be said about the history of utility interconnection between music and architecture, but I think that all form of creation is born from something that comes beforehand, an intuition, an idea, a thought. And for me here, inside this world, which is so deeply virtual in this time, as I told you yesterday, I had the fortune to do a live show yesterday and 2 days ago in Torino. It was a very refreshing change from being so much in loneliness and so much in virtuality. But I think that somehow this dialogue with Daniel, for which I'm very grateful, and treasuring Daniel's mastery and deep thought, it somehow became also a kind of a beautiful anomaly in which you have a composition that is not performed and a drawing which was not built and will never be built. So I think that at the end of the line, what I'm trying to say is, you know, during COVID, we learned so much about our vulnerability. And I think that the first rule of a house, of a habitat, is to create safety. And I think that the first condition to feel sound is our vulnerability. And I think somehow the complementary relation between safety and vulnerability is all what it's about, in a way.
Should we listen to your music now, Yuval, and see some of the imagery by Daniel?
Sure.
Many years ago, more than 30 years ago, I created a project called Theatrum Mundi. Which was a series of drawings and texts that related to the idea that cities are threatened by infections.
beautiful. And amazing that you found that connection. You found that connection, Yuval, with Daniel through the accordion.
Well, you know, accordion was a starting point.
Was the starting point, yeah.
Starting point.
Yeah.
You know, a little bit like two guys meeting in a bar and speaking about soccer.
Yeah.
We started speaking about accordion. But very soon, I think we spoke about the importance of ascendance and descendance. And I think that this is something that is connected to aesthetics, it's connected to ethics and to political situation in which sometimes orders need to crawl down in order to give birth to something. And of course, the composition at the end result is manifestation of an order. But at the same time, I think that the courage to do something which is unstable, and I guess that if you say unstable to an architect, he freaks out. And the instability is what make a movement in which you find life.
Can we bring Lily in again? And I think it's really interesting that that you both thought in terms of reading images, but from different perspectives, of course, because Yuval was creating the sonic composition. Lily, you were creating the image for Hannah to respond to. I'm wondering what you both feel about interdisciplinary thinking. Is it something that can be taught? And I know you teach at the AA, Lily, or is it really something that is intuitive? So for you, Yuval, it must be natural because, as we can see with your background, you're also a visual artist, a painter. So what do you both think? Lily, do you think that interdisciplinary thinking and processes can be taught and should be taught?
I mean, I think they're kind of totally natural. I think we're all, I guess, musicians, right? And we all understand architecture. I mean, we all kind of can imagine drawing spaces or making spaces, I think. And I think it is something incredibly natural about it. But of course, through the disciplinary work of studying and teaching, and we get kind of pigeonholed. And it seems like, I think more than maybe interdisciplinariness, which I think is really important, but collaboration is a really interesting project, you know, and I really like Yuval's image of two people looking down at something that was kind of coming into being, because it has to be, if it's a good collaboration, it has to be you're creating something that you wouldn't have created unless you were collaborating, right? It has to be something new, born from the two of you. And that's, I mean, an incredible creative thing. I think that happens with interdisciplinary, I suppose that does happen with interdisciplinary thinking, but even it happens with true collaborations as well.
Yeah. Yuval?
I have to say that what Lily said is exactly what I wanted to say, so I will just rephrase it in order not to sound dumb. I think that interdisciplinarity is something so rooted in our being. We are luckily not just one sensory channel minds. We have movement, we have breath, we have voice, we have ears, we have eyes. I think that the challenge of educators is not to mess up this natural process of us looking at the world in so many different levels. And we are over 100 years after the Bauhaus movement and many other models, Black Mountain College, etc. I think that the strive of having wonderful, productive people that are doing just tiny nails inside the machine had driven us nuts to become closed in shells. But the moment you open things up, I see my 4 years old daughter, princess, angel, whatever, Alma. She is an interdisciplinary person, being. She's doing all this stuff.
Yeah.
And I think that when I would say something that might sound a little bit new age or banal, but I think that if we start a dialogue and we want to go deep, we need to be children again, not to be afraid to play. Because if I come from my safety zone, you know, and an architect comes or a dancer comes or a scientist comes, it's going to be just an overlapping. And overlapping is extremely boring. But we need to remember also ritual is interdisciplinary. No, it's very deep in culture.
It strikes me that we're both interested in choreography as well. Lily, I love the way that you said that you think of architecture in terms of steps. And Yuval, you've worked a lot with dancers. I wondered if you can both imagine these projects also having the added dimension of dance. Lily?
Yuval, do you want to start with that while I think for a minute?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Yuval's already thought about this.
Finance Clare Farrow to make a wonderful show. I think that what we've done, we created sound and we created space and we created visual, and it can be, hopefully, when COVID madness will somehow become a memory of the past, even a closed past or a tolerated past, it would be wonderful to live all these artworks. And I listened to all the pieces and I saw all the images, to live them as a physical experience. And in this physical experience, maybe some could have dancers inside of them, some could have smells inside of them, some can have some sensory elements inside of them. And I think that, you know, with all these webinars, I think that we would all like that the webinar will finish and we all go for a round of beers, you know, at least. Yeah. So
okay, that's the date. Yeah.
And
Lily,
I think that this experience of expanding something, when it's shaky, it's enough to just to let it go and then to go to the next one. But when it's strong, it can expand in remarkable ways, for sure.
Lily?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know quite how to, I mean, it would be amazing. I think it's really enjoyable as an architect or a creator of space to think through movement and you know, notations of movement, and particularly when you think about, you know, the scale of the city and then the scale of the body and the different bits that your body moves around, and how architecture frames that and then enforces certain movements. And that would be like having, you know, physical objects as part of this would be really wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to turn to PiM Studio, to its founders Maurizio Mucciola and Maria Chiara Pizzinelli, who've collaborated with sound artist McConville on a project for Musicity Expo called Architecture Meets Nature Meets Sound. So over to you.
Yeah. Hi, hello everyone. Yes, the project, when we were invited to take part in this project, this collaboration, we had thought about what to do and what to present, and we finally decided to present and to sort of reimagine in a way. So we remade drawings for a project that we had done, an unrealized project that we had done a few years ago. And that was for a very tiny music hall in the Italian Alps. And this project was developed as a competition design for this very small village in the Alps, and it was maybe a couple of years ago. And when we started looking at the competition, the design brief for the requests from the brief, and most importantly, we started looking at the context, at the site, the place where the project had to be. We thought that the place was just unbelievably beautiful, and we thought it was complete. Often as architects, we look at the site where the project has to be, and then we think, what can we add? So how can we design our architecture so that it makes it as it completes the site, it adds something more to the site and makes it richer. In this case, we thought the site doesn't need much more than what it has, because it's already as amazing. It had an amazing view toward the lake, the Lugano Lake, and we thought that architecture should just be very, very simple and should almost disappear, and the project should be not very much about architecture, but it should be mainly about music and nature. And that's how we developed the project, and we focused only on these two elements to try to design as little as possible and to leave only the two most important elements in the entire proposal, which were music and nature.
I know the place quite well because when I was young, I used to walk in the Alps. I was scout for a very long time, and this is a village that is close to my hometown in the north of Italy. So I know those Alps, and I know the place by memory, let's say. And what the first challenge that I actually found when we started to look at the project, there was actually this fifth facade, the roof of the architecture, seen from above. This is like always, I think, a critical point of design when you are building in the Alps or in the mountains, because you have all the mountains surrounding, looking down at you, at your building, and looking at what you are designing. So then we felt that actually nature, and I would say that we felt that we need a collaboration with nature, and this is what actually Lily was just mentioning, that through a collaboration between architecture and nature, we try to let's say build a space for music. So this is how I feel this project came along. So we worked with nature. We kind of lift the nature up, and we found a space for music underneath. And we wanted to have a green roof that felt, let's say, that was full of local species. So then it would, let's say, naturally evolve with the rest of the side of the landscape. And then finally, we hope, let's say, that nature is not just, let's say, the green roof, but then it will be populated by actual small animals, and then it will be really a hub for biodiversity and being a part of the mountain where it sits.
Should we look at the interior as well?
Yes, because also what thanks.
Yeah.
What we thought, and for the interior, to try to again keep it as simple as possible, but also as open as possible toward nature, and to create this relation, this collaboration, as Chiara just mentioned, between architecture and nature with music inside. We wanted to keep it open, and I think in our dream was, or would be, that the sounds of nature, the sounds from birds and from animals, from the surrounding area, from the surrounding area of the architecture of the site, it will mix with the music played inside. the whole, and that will create a richer and more intense experience for everybody. And for that, we used, or we proposed using only wood for the interior, so both the floor and walls and the roof, they're all created in wood, and to keep it simple and to keep this simple connection to the nature. But most importantly, we have these openable walls and this very big window on the back of the stage, so that people could, both in summer, then it would be, or when it's warmer, it will be completely open, but even at night or in winter, then this large window will mix music and nature at the same time, so that the background of music will just be nature, and the architecture will somehow disappear, and you have this magical landscape that creates a better experience, or a sort of a more collaborative experience between music, architecture, and nature. And that was the main sort of point of the project. We thought this collaborative project between us and Build, and trying to think about relation and collaboration between architecture and music and nature. And in this case, it was quite the most interesting drawings and project that we could sort of recreate. We have sort of reinvented the drawings for this project, for this collaboration, and it's been very interesting experience.
It looks so beautiful. I can imagine sitting there and with the nature and listening to the music. So should we now listen to McConville's music with your images? Thank you. Fascinating. Yeah. So that really fits in with your philosophy of rewilding architecture, doesn't it? Of bringing nature right into the experience of architecture.
Yes, I mean it does, and I mean that's one of the sort of themes that we explore, not only in this project but in many of our works, and also we were particularly happy with this collaboration, with this dialogue with McConville, and we had exchanged a few texts and emails while he was working on this piece, and we were very happy because when he started sending us his first draft piece, then we were listening to it, and we immediately thought that it was perfect, if you like, because when I was listening to it, if I close my eyes, I will literally imagining being inside or just outside or on the roof of our project, listening to a nice, beautiful electronic music, but mixed with the sound of nature, of the surrounding space. So I think it sort of captured the idea of our design in the most perfect way.
And did you learn a lot about thinking in terms of acoustics and sound when you created the V&A Dundee with Kengo Kuma? Were you involved in that side of thinking about the acoustics within that amazing structure?
Yes, actually, I believe that acoustic is essential to really being explored and studied. Every project needs to be paying attention to the acoustic and to the material you use for the interior design, especially because like being in a space that is too loud or that it's very confusing, it is affecting your experience of being there and like your well-being and your enjoyment of the architecture itself. And so I think music and like noise needs to be controlled by the design of the space. And we, for example, in Dundee, actually, we were so surprised when we opened, when there was the opening event. Actually, Marita can tell you like
yeah, it was very, I mean, the opening was very sort of noisy, very busy, as you can imagine. And but the acoustic of the place responds very well, because we thought, we obviously we wanted to have a space, as Chiara said, that you can really enjoy. And I think in this sense, I think it's very interesting because the work that goes into acoustic design, especially of a large public space, like could be a museum hall or any other sort of large museum public space, is very important. It's a lot of sort of detailed work in terms of the acoustic and what materials, sort of acoustic materials to use and so on, and try to hide them, because acoustic is one of the things that is, if it's perfect and it's perfectly designed, when you don't realize that it's being designed. So when you enter a space and you enjoy the space, you have sort of, you can enjoy the sound and the music, and you talk to people, you can listen to a show, or you can listen to what other people are saying without background noise, without other disturbing, or with the background noise, but without that becoming disturbing, and you don't realize that. So when you know, that's sort of natural, and that's when the design is perfect, because you don't realize that it's there. You don't realize that it's being designed for that purpose. You can just enjoy the space and the sounds and whatever else, so the environment that
Yes, and I think your point, Maria Chiara, about acoustics and well-being is very important, because acoustics is not just about music. It's about just all the sounds and noises within a space, and that connection to well-being seems really important. So on that note, let's turn to Arup and to Ed Elbourne and Ned Crowe, excuse me, who are going to talk about their work. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Claire. Yes, so in our practice at Arup, Ned and I design a lot of performance spaces for music, and we think a lot about the relationship between architecture and music. Can I have the first slide, please, Freddie? Thank you. This is the Susie Sainsbury Theatre at the Royal Academy of Music, which we completed with Ian Ritchie Architects in 2018. Now, something unique to this room is its limited geometric volume, which is due to the site constraints of heritage building on all four sides, planning height limits above, and tube lines below. In this context, we had to carefully curate a sound that was clear and well blended without being boomy or loud. And as part of this design process, in which we worked with Ian Ritchie's team to curate this sound personality, we imagined the theatre as an intricate music box, as a carefully crafted musical instrument. Next slide, please. And this narrative of the concert hall as a musical instrument is an attractive one. It's one that we've used on other projects too, including the Bioloca in Kent, which is in the top left-hand corner there, which Ned will speak about in a little while. It's a nice metaphor, but actually it's more than just a nice metaphor. When we hear music, it's rarely just the sound coming from the instrument. Next slide, please. It's true that in the open outdoors that's the case, but inside any building it's not the case. Inside a building, almost all of what we are hearing is not the instrument. It's the sound of the room, which has been energized by the instrument. Next slide, please. The musician needs to be a master not just of their own instrument, but also a second instrument, which is the room, which is connected to the first. And every room makes an instrument sound different. So what are our primary considerations when we're designing this musical instrument? Well, like any composer or musician, we focus on two questions. Who are the audience, and what do we want them to experience? These are tricky questions because we know that every human being experiences the world differently. Next slide, please. Some people's experience is strongly dominated by what they see, some people by what they hear. Most people are somewhere in the middle. Whoever we are, our senses of sight and sound are inexorably linked. In the 20th century, a lot of music venues were commonly designed by antagonists at the extreme ends of this scale, by architects who'd spent 7 years training to respond visually, and acousticians who'd spent years responding orally. For us, balancing the oral and the visual experience informs our practice designing venues. And just as there is no such thing as a neutral musical instrument, there is no design of concert hall which lets you hear the music directly from the musician without adding some sort of timbre, some sort of personality. This is why, for example, we recoil at terms and descriptions such as perfect acoustics, no matter how flattering that term is. What does perfect mean in this context? And because of our intrinsically linked senses of sight and sound, this personality needs to manifest in the visual as well as the oral. For example, concrete can make music sound cold, and wood can turn it warm, even when a microphone can detect no measurable difference between the two. For every project we design, we need to think carefully about what this personality will be. Like any music composer looking at a blank manuscript pad, we need inspiration. Next slide, please. In some projects, like the Royal Academy of Music, which we've just seen, or the Biloca, which Ned will talk about shortly, the inspiration comes from circumstance, from the constraints of the existing site, the existing building. But often we have a completely blank manuscript pad, such as our recent competition collaboration with Kengo Kuma for the Shenzhen Opera House. For this project, we sought to reflect the bold, self-confident, tech-savvy, high-rise city of Shenzhen through a vivid, expansive, grandiose sound, told through a sense of verticality. And this curation of the music environment is fundamentally linked to the architectural form. We needed to establish the personality of this hall even before we started to sketch out the simple dimensions of the space. For any space for music, the design of the architecture is the curation of an audience experience. By focusing on the audience, we strive to curate an experience that is holistic, one that is cohesive. In these spaces, music and architecture are just two sides of the same coin.
Thanks, Ed.
Can we have the next slide, please? So I'd like to briefly introduce a project that Ed and I have been working on recently. It's a major refurbishment of the concert saal at the Biloca in Ghent in Belgium. The original building opened in 1228 as a hospital, and it was run by a congregation of Catholic nuns. In the old photographs, you can see patients lying in beds in a large open space underneath the wooden roof truss for which an entire oak forest in the south of Belgium would have been cut down. Next slide, please. In 1988, the space was used as a concert hall for the first time, but after 30 years, a thorough renovation was needed. The sight lines and the accessibility didn't meet modern expectations. It lacked intimacy, and the natural acoustics were rather dry and lacking in envelopment. One of the reasons for this is that over the last 800 years, the stone side walls have gradually angled outwards from a vertical position to an angle which has happened over the years under the weight of the roof. Unfortunately, having walls in this particular position means that those critical side reflections that you get from the orchestral sound is then sent over the heads of the audience, making the sound rather one-dimensional. Next slide, please. In the renovation design with DRDH architects, these challenges were tackled within the context of the historic building. The architectural concept was to build a new dish or vessel inside the hall. And that was an important part of the design and a requirement of the historic curators of the space. Vertical timber sidewalls were constructed to provide early strong sound reflections to the audience. The shaping of the timber wall lining helps to scatter the reflected sound to create a much more even distribution across the audience area. The floor was lowered by 1.2 meters, and that improved the sight lines for the audience. It also improved the accessibility for the performers and the instruments onto the platform without needing to use the lift. And it also, by lowering the floor, increases the geometric volume of the hall, which helps to improve the natural reverberance. The performance platform was shifted forwards, which not only makes the space more intimate for the audience, but provides room for up to 110 seats behind the platform, which could either be used by choir or audience. And actually that visual connection of watching a performer on a platform, but also then seeing the reaction of other people behind the platform, really does help to create a much more intimate and shared experience for the people who are in the hall. The overall, there was an overall reduction in seat count from 975 to 720, and this reduction of sound absorbing bodies also helps to increase the natural reverberance of the space. Next slide, please. Of course, the sound experience for the performers is equally important as the sound for the audience. And whenever we're designing spaces for performance, whether it's music or drama, the experience for the performers is very much a big part of our thinking process as we're collaborating with the architects and the other designers in the process. So in this particular hall, a new reflector array was installed above the platform to provide sound reflections from above, which are essential for timing between the different sections of the orchestra to achieve a good ensemble. The renovated hall opened last month, and it's hosting performances at the moment with limited audience, and we're looking forward to when they're able to open the doors to much larger audiences. Next slide, please. In the design of any space, the total experience of the people who will be spending time there needs to be considered from the outset. What we hear has a significant influence over our perception of the space. As Ed has already said, colour can actually have a subjective effect on how we perceive the sound of a space. And that goes for every space. It doesn't matter if it's a concert hall or a classroom, a church, a station, an office, a hospital. Early conversations with architects and designers on how do we want the space to sound, and how does that work in the context of the overall experience is absolutely essential right from the beginning. Since much of what we hear and our preferences are so subjective and it's difficult to articulate, it's always important to listen together. So when we're designing a new space for the performance of music, we'll visit a number of example spaces and listen and discuss what we hear and what we like and what works well. Next slide, please. To help supplement such listening exercises, we often generate digital simulations of different acoustic spaces, and this allows oral comparisons of existing and modelled future spaces. This is the Sound Lab that we have in London, which we bring people into regularly to listen and make comparisons of different spaces. Very often, these kind of experiences spark a discussion on people's preferences of different acoustic environments when they're directly compared with each other. Next slide, please. And more recently, we've been taking these simulations to the next level by integrating 3D interactive real-time visuals to the audio simulation, and this allows the discussion to take to a much deeper level as we talk about our experiences of a future or model space compared with spaces that we actually know. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks to you both. I think that's fascinating, and the interactive simulation as well. It kind of allows you to discover so much, doesn't it, at an earlier stage? Shall we bring the rest of the panelists in now? I thought it would be interesting to ask Yuval, who's a performer himself, He's an amazing guitarist. What's your experience of acoustics in terms of what's your experience been like as a performer? And have you had a favorite performance space in terms of acoustics?
Well, I think that as a performer, I'm quite used to somehow natural spaces that in a way try to reduce the identity of an architectural space, which for me is a bit boring, must say. With my large-scale pieces and installation, I usually work with very special architectural places. There is an opera that was produced in the baths of Diocletian in Rome, which has a completely wrong, wonderful architecture. Alma Mater, my sound installation for 140 loudspeaker, was in a space called the Cathedral in La Fabbrica del Vapore, the steam factory in Milan, covering 1,200 square meters of a huge, empty, high factory. And actually, when Ned started speaking about their virtual laboratory, it made me kind of starving to create a collaboration exploring wrong spaces, because I guess that if we can do something which is completely in tune with Mozart, what happens if we take a space and we build it completely wrong, turning it in a way to a musical instrument? And I think that, you know, yes, in Renaissance, they made wonderful cathedrals and wrote beautiful music that was site-specific for the cathedral. And we all know these examples, but I think that every performance has as a musical instrument the whole and the architectural space. And I think it's about the artist, the sound artist, not to impose his ego and say, no, my idea comes first of the physical space, please obey in one way or another, and this will be my favorite concert hall or another. But what happens if you find yourself in a train station? What happens if you find yourself in a cave? What happens if you find yourself in a skyscraper and you have the staircase, the emergency staircase? And I think that here comes a different kind of creativity in which, you know, Eurocentric Western paradigm is all about detachment. We detach the requiem from mourning, we detach visual from sound, and somehow we want to have this kind of abstract experiences, but it's much more exciting to go into a place, just feeling it, clapping it, and seeing what it goes. So I don't know if it makes some sense what I'm saying.
Mm-hmm. I thought it was fascinating, Ed, that you said that the experience of colours affects how people experience sound inside a space. I thought that was
totally. I think, you know, everyone's different how we respond, right? Lots of people respond very visually, lots of people respond very orally, but those things are inexorably linked. And you know, I guess we're not always aware of how these effects that the different senses are happening. I mean, I guess the same's true for smell as well. I've never thought about how a performance space should smell. But yeah, we do in our digital lab that Ned showed. There's an experiment you do where you play the noise, which is just pink noise. It's kind of just you know, noise of all frequencies. And while we do that, we can either play a video of traffic on a motorway, or you can play a video of a waterfall. And if you bring someone in and you've got the video of the waterfall, everyone finds it very relaxing and they think, well, that's very nice. If you bring them in with a road, I think they get very stressed. It sounds very annoying. You know, it sounds like a very aggressive sound. Actually, it's just the same sound, but we're conditioned to respond to it differently by what we see.
It would be interesting to do an experiment with the perfume and the music, different scent and music in a concert hall. Lily, do you think about sounds when you're designing and scent? I'm sure you do think about scent when you're designing a garden. Does acoustics come into it?
Well, certainly with the Maggie Centres, we've been very careful with acoustics because it's such a fundamental part to how you feel in a space. It's kind of directly emotional. One of the things I've been thinking about during this conversation actually is how architecture, and particularly with Yuval's last comment, that it is possible to think about architecture in a way, in a very abstract way, that that you can't do with music, I think, maybe. And so one of the troubles with architecture, I find, that it is possible to abstract it and to totally kind of lose an emotional relationship to it. Maybe, I think scent, because it's one of the earliest senses, and also sound, because you kind of can't control it and you're in a state of distraction when you experience it. It has a deeper emotional kind of power, like, you know, kind of unleashes something in you, even if it's minor. But there's something interesting to me in this conversation about the way that architecture can, you know, we don't talk about emotions much in architecture. We're a bit scared of it, I think, as architects. You know, it's like slightly uncontrollable, it's wild, it's messy, and I think it's an interesting thing in bringing these two things together, that it's making me, and I don't know if you guys in PiM Studio have that feeling as well, that we don't kind of unpack that messiness very much as architects. And I don't, probably the audience, so we hope to have some architects in the audience who might want to comment on that as well, and how, you know, how we've divorced ourselves from that. There are really emotional buildings. Obviously, I was thinking a musical building to me is Peter Eisenman's Memorial, right, which is in Berlin, which is incredibly musical, waves and these huge blocks, and also incredibly emotional for its content, but also kind of viscerally emotional. And obviously Daniel Liebeskind's buildings are very like that too, but there's not much, maybe. I mean, there is in the history of architecture, but not day to day when we design architecture. And we're not with our students being like, you know, make it more kind of passionate in some way.
I was
we've lost language in architecture. Yeah.
I was interested in the approach that we've seen of the different examples this evening. Of quite often the pairings have been, the music has been a response. The creation of the music has been a response to the visual. In all of the examples this evening, it's always been that flow of architecture or visual and inspiring the music. And I wonder if any of the panelists have had experience of something of a direction where the visual and the architecture has been inspired by a particular sound or that kind of way of working.
I think often architecture actually hides, let's say, sounds within architecture itself. So the rhythm that you actually use to design a facade or to design the structure of a building often actually has a very peculiar, let's say, reference to music, and especially, yes, as I said, rhythm is definitely part of architecture and part of mainly the facade. And like great big architects, as Lily was saying, the presentation, I showed the design of, let's say, how music and architecture use actually the same method often, like in order to define beauty in a way, or like to get closer to beauty. And I think architecture also define maybe, how can I say, experience through sounds that are experienced maybe of quiet space or intimacy. So like how we design, or at least how we at PiM Studio try to control the sound, is where we want to really create a space that is very intimate, that is quiet, and then is like creates privacy, and creates at least a way of designing a space that the first, let's say, the first element is about quietness, and is about like being in an intimate environment. So then, like, I think especially there, I feel that actually architecture gets very, very close to emotion, because like it actually, the space itself that allow you to be in a state of mind, in a state of being. So yeah, I believe a lot in the power of the space and the architecture to kind of communicate feelings and emotion, like to exchange, let's say, feeling and emotion with the people.
If I can comment on
yes, do Yuval. Yes.
I think it's a great idea. What will happen if if I send you a sound and each of you could create space, but which will not respect the sound, but will change the sound, will somehow distort the sound, elaborate the sound, becoming the home of the sound. I think that this kind of idea can be really great and fascinating as an artwork, as a meditative space, and yeah, I think that could be extremely exciting. You know, some of my sound sculptures work as the way that sound can flow inside space and void, as the key word that was mentioned before. And I think that maybe an architect, I think the problem is the utility, that somehow architects always oblige to utility, because at the end of the line, if somehow the way you walk, you don't find the bathroom, the client become crazy, you know, you have all these constraints, which makes you very, very, very obliged to do something extremely pleasing for so many different clients or minds or issues. You know, I'm thinking about the Ombroik Museum. I don't know if you're familiar, the Ombroik Museum in Düsseldorf, which is one of the most beautiful museums, I think, in the world, which was created out of the rocket station of NATO, in which the founder had commissioned the architect to create these kind of pavilions without any guideline at all. And what you created actually was incredibly interesting sound chambers, that each one functions in a different way from an acoustic point of view, because you took off from the equation the need of being very efficient. So yeah, would be wonderful.
That would be wonderful. So maybe for the next project, we begin with music and then we see what architects can do with that. So we've had one question from the audience, which is about whether wood, and I suppose this relates very much to your project, Maurizio and Maria Chiara, whether wood is actually the best acoustic material for the interior of a music venue.
I think maybe Netherhead can be more sort of technical on that.
Yes. Is it the case, or is it just the kind of the impression that
there's not really. There's no reason why you can't make the internal surfaces of a music performance space from any different type of material. What's important acoustically is its weight, how heavy it is, because that influences the frequencies of sound that it reflects. So if you have a very lightweight material, it will you'll end up with a space which is lacking in warmth, because lightweight materials absorb low frequency sound. So it's the weight of the material used and the shaping. But actually, there's nothing that says it has to be wood. But a lot of subjectively, a lot of musicians, having spoken to many about it, like to have some elements of wood around them when they play. That's just a preference by a number of musicians. Doesn't apply to all musicians, but some. Yuval, maybe may have a comment.
Do you like to be surrounded by wood, Yuval? I think by colour. I can see you like to be surrounded by colour.
I think that the wood is connected to classical music and classical paradigm. Everybody that was in punk and in death metal don't like so much wood, and maybe would go with cement and metal. And you know, it's that there is nothing like, you know, an ugly sound. And I think that this concept, the canonization of right sound and wrong sound is, you know, after John Cage and after the futuristic and after opening ourselves to so many cultures, it's not about that. If you want to have a wonderful wrapped up concert of a quartet where you go and perfume yourself, and wood is a part of the ritual. At the end, concert halls are ritual halls in which a kind of a culture celebrate a form of culture. But if you go to Tibetan monks and you surrounded them by wood, it would be completely out of the questions. Or I think about the synagogues with the shofar and people moaning. Beautiful sound is, you know, when it reaches you. And I think that also with concert hall and concert programming is somehow, you know, you have all these wonderful wooden halls, but they are not ready to include multimedia works. So, and I was in touch with different programmers, and they said there are too many videos. We don't know where to hang the screens. So I think that that places need to have identity, like that people need to have a kind of an authenticity. You know, if you go to a place and you don't know where you are in Delaware or Denver or London or Shanghai, you know, it's sad. And
yes, same thing it is for architecture. I mean, architecture needs to be part of the place, and the place has a character that is within the place itself. So I think besides the use of wood, or specifically that type of wood, I think.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, to go back to what has been said, but also to go back to that initial question from the audience. I think what's important, but not just in music halls, it's important for all spaces to think about the materials and to think about what the sound of that material. Because often, and I think that goes back to what was discussed earlier about the fact that in our culture we usually sort of separate the senses, so the sight, and we give quite a lot of importance to the visual aspect of things, especially in architecture. Mostly architects, they think about how you see architecture. What do you see? What's the color? You know, when you're choosing a material, you think what it looks like. You know, does this stone looks good for the floor? But we not often think, and I think we do have, and it's very important to think, you know, what does the sound of this floor when you work on it? What's the sound of this floor when you throw something on it, where something falls, when, you know, some, you know, children are playing in this floor? Does it make it a nice sound? Does it make a sound you like, or this wall or the ceiling or something? And it's not just about acoustic performance. It's about imperfections, and it's about what the sounds that relates to each material. Because often we focus a lot on, you know, choosing colors or choosing the texture of this wood. You like darker wood or lighter wood or this tone, but we don't think about the other sense. We don't think about how does it feel when you touch something. Does it feel cold, or is rough, or is smooth, and choosing things about with other senses in mind. And I think that's in architecture is very important, and for us it's always important to think about the relation between materials that we choose in our designs and the other senses, not just the visual aspect of what you see in the space, on the color, and everything else.
We've got a few minutes left, so anyone in the audience, if you'd like to ask any more questions, please write your question into the chat. I wanted to talk to you all just a little bit about this COVID-19 situation that we're in relation to performance, because of course singers, musicians, actors haven't been able to perform, and whether you think that is maybe necessary to think more in terms of outdoor venues of some kind for performance, for music, and if you would be interested in considering that, and what kind of acoustic issues would arise from doing that. So Ed.
Can I also just say, you've mentioned the artists and the performers who are currently not able to perform, but I just want to give a shout out also for the huge number of backstage people who are currently still struggling to work.
Yes, makeup artists, all kind.
Yeah,
you're right.
So shout out for them as well.
Yeah.
To answer your question, I know that when we looked a couple of years ago at the Arvo Part installation, we initially looked at it out in Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens.
In Vauxhall Gardens, yeah.
Which was an interesting, as the first public park in the UK, thinking about how that was a curated space. It's now got a train line going alongside, so in terms of the soundscape, it's very different. But we were thinking there, I think, about what can we do? What do we want to in the words of Elsie from part one, do we want to just stop the sound coming in? Do we want to somehow kind of feather the soundscape into what we're trying to play through the pavilion? I think it's a fascinating question, and we've done bandstands and we've done projects like this. So looking at the architecture and the fundamental shape of architecture and how you can help carry sound out in the open air through the shape of the architecture. How you can create areas where the sound isn't as well, if you don't want to annoy neighbors, and how you do that. So it's a huge topic.
Lily, can you imagine perhaps thinking more in terms of integrating some kind of performance space into a landscape garden design?
Yeah, I mean, I think landscape has to, when you think through a garden, we often think more, I think, kind of holistically, phenomenologically, words there. But you're very aware of the spatial kind of qualities and sound effects of being in different types of landscapes, and how you buffer or kind of amplify the surrounding spaces. I suppose I haven't designed a performance space, but certainly always thinking of a person performing through any garden or landscape that you were designing. You always think kind of situating that person in it as they walk and move through it as a kind of performance thought.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, but like we should always, let's say, remember that the typology of the Hellenic theater, it is, let's say, the essential of the theater. It is being outdoor and actually having nature as a backstage and enjoy. I mean, that kind of the performance is thought to be in the nature with open air. So I think we should definitely embrace the open air and like design performances, open air and spaces, let's say, as architects. Like we should be able to work, say, with landscape designers in order to have a three-dimensional space where the performance can happen at the best, actually even better, if possible, than in the indoor. So
it must be harder, it's harder to model and harder to control. And so I think you have to use your gut more. I feel like that with landscape. I mean, I work as a landscape architect and an architectural designer, and with landscape you're out of control a lot of the time, and you're dealing with living things and they're moving and changing, and then it rains, or then they build a road. but you're having to be kind of more like an action painter somehow, like on the site, also like seeing it in real time and listening to it and then working with it. So one of the differences in the
just one comment from the audience, from Terry John, who's a lighting designer, and talking about the emotional impact of lighting in the environment as well. And I imagine lighting, like you were talking about the emotional aspect of a space, Lily, lighting as well as colour must also impact on how you experience music inside a space. Would you say that, Yuval, from your experience of performance?
Of course, and I think that all of us had the sensation of entering a cave as kids in a school, and this feeling of the ears opening and listening to every drop of water, and we all remember some kind of gigglings when the sun is on your face in a park, and this is us being multisensory beings. And even though that, again, you have concerts where you need to have a kind of standard, well-educated light and standard, well-educated phenomenon. I think that during a psychedelic period, if we speak about the UFO Club and light show and sound and cellars and all this stuff, it can go up and down in many ways. I wanted to go shortly back to your previous question about the COVID and this open space and closed space. First of all, I wanted to say that we shouldn't neglect the importance of the virtual space. As you know, Claire, I did during these 5 months a huge participatory artwork for dancers and singers involving 177 dancers and voice artists from 46 countries. It's called Human Science, by the way, human/science.com, which is all for free, and it's not commissioned and produced by anyone. And actually now it was launched, the website in Manifest, and we did many live streams. We are going to a step of live grid where we have a center of artists, for example, in New York, that are going to do live grid performances, just creating a grid line and perform in a street, on a roof, in the middle of town. And you know that the concert hall is one thing, but the ambient in the city can give us many opportunities. And there was, in the lockdown of Italy, which was devastating in the first months, there were many examples of people getting out of the windows, starting singing one to another, and there was a high death toll, and there were people singing, and this was a concert hall. It was an amazing concert hall. So, you know, of course, some people say Stone Age was a concert hall in a way, and it might be so, it makes sense. But first of all, we should remember our cities, we should remember our tunnels, we should remember the place, the neighborhood which are abandoned, and start thinking, how can we not interrupt turning them to a performance center? And I think that here it could be wonderful to involve light designers and sound people and all these wonderful things that are really in a tough spot. Make the city become a meta auditorium.
There are lots and lots of people sending comments, so I'm trying to read them. They're really long comments. So there's someone called Mario Mora Olamedo, who is saying, is there a way to build or think about architecture like a spatial instrument? So that's an interesting idea. And there's Monica Olanrewaju is saying, is there a way to measure or monitor how sound within a space changes over time as interior alterations are introduced during a building's lifetime? Do you ever think, Ed and Ned, in terms of the aging of a building? Is that something?
there's very practical side of it. So, for example, the Symphony Hall in Birmingham is built on rubber pads, which is about keeping it very, very quiet. So it doesn't have any rigid connection anywhere, to the world at all. It makes it very, very quiet inside. And we go along every 2 years and we measure the pads. We make sure they've not squashed anymore. We make sure it's not any bridging or that kind of thing. So there's a very practical, technical side of we measure things and we make sure that they stay the same. I think there is also this question of spaces feeling lived in. There's a David Hare quote, the playwright, who talks about old theatres having the memories of old performances in their walls, and it's something that's very intangible, but it's talking about, in these performance spaces, the walls just have this residue of all the performances that have gone. And I don't know what it is, but I think there is something immeasurable about that. You go into an old space and it's the gravitas of it, I suppose. You know who's played there. You know that there has been every night for the last 50 years an audience of 500 people who've decided to come into a room and sit together in silence and give something their attention. And the building, for us, a new building doesn't have that. When we sit in the opening nights of a concert hall or a theatre, it's just a building that's been a building site. It's been very functional and it hasn't yet got that humanity. So I don't know. I think that side I don't think is so measurable, but there's something ethereal about it, I suppose.
In terms of measuring the acoustics of a space, it's something that we do regularly, is to measure the impulse response. And the impulse response is the response of any space. It could be outside, it could be inside, any shape or size, to a clap, a bang, and a short burst of energy. And what you hear is first, if you're in that space, the first thing you hear is the direct sound. Ed touched on this earlier, and then you hear a sequence of reflections which are arriving at different times and from different directions and from different intensities, and that's actually often described that as the acoustic fingerprint of a space. And if we wanted to monitor how a space changes over time, we could make impulse response measurements in different conditions, of course, whether there's an empty space or whether there's lots of people in that space. That changes the way a space sounds. Over the years, dust may settle on surfaces which will make those surfaces more absorbent to sound at high frequencies. Also changes the character of the sound. So there are ways of measuring the acoustic characteristics of a space and then recreating that in a simulated space like I showed earlier. So you can take what we call anechoic sound, which is sound which has been recorded in a completely dry, acoustic-less space. We can convolve that with that dry sound with the impulse response, which is the characteristic that we've measured at different times over different years, and then listen to how that space has changed over time via simulation. So yeah, it's
fascinating. So I'm gonna end with someone from the audience, their comment, Marcus, who suggests that we should rethink audience design in a way to let the passive consumer take part in a more active way instead of just sitting and listening. I guess a little bit like someone who walks through a garden is active. Is there a way of making an audience for music more active? It's quite an interesting idea, isn't it, for the future, maybe. So, so thank you, everyone. Thank you, all the panelists. Thank you for the audience for making all your comments, which we'll print out in case we missed any. Thank you to Sto Werkstatt for making this webinar possible, and to Nick Luscombe, who dreamt up the idea of Musicity Expo. And I think we're going to leave the chat a little bit open for the audience, and we're going to play Lily's video for everyone. She's looking concerned. Her video with her words for her project, The Horizon. Okay, thank you so much, everyone, and goodbye.
streets so that your steps are a metronome. Capture every 10 steps the street elevation that rises opposite you, the horizon where the building meets the sky. Your heart always bleeds to the horizon. This weather always morphs to that weather. 30 minutes in July, walk in a clockwise direction, always returning to the horizon. This drawing is a map of a street, like Ed Richet's Every Elevation on Sunset Strip, the capturing of an urban environment with all of the political, economic variations in a city along a single street transept. Except here the city has been stripped, and we focus on the changing sky. The horizon is high through narrow streets, the muttering retreats, and solid profiles hold steady against the amorphous atmosphere. The clouds rushing over the city mark time, following the jet stream that keeps the UK temperate. These rivers in the sky move against our weather from west to east, constantly trying to keep up with the globe. We want to cross the river, the brown amorphous surface of the thick, impenetrable Thames. Barrier of secrets, drowner of drains, cauldron of nutrients, primordial milk nurture, tidal force channeler, historic floodder. An enigmatic surface flows open and lets the horizon out to a distant dynamic line. In the 30 minutes of this walk, 2,500 million gallons of water has passed under this bridge. The Thames brings the sea to the centre of London. There is nowhere nature is more present in the city, and yet less seen by us. Passing the river, the city encloses us. Again, industry, diesel, people's daily lives. The horizon zips up again to snip out the sky. What does it mean to capture a place in a drawing? The first role of a designer is to map a site, to read and record its forms, its flows, its temperatures. Every map is an abstraction. This map captures some flows of the city, weather and water, on July 23rd, on their way somewhere else.